So last week I started a series where I'm reading Fool Me Twice, Fighting the Assault on Science in America by Shawn Lawrence Otto, and got through Chapter 1, so let's continue with Chapter 2. Is Science Political? Like the previous chapter, this one starts with a quote. There is nothing which can better deserve your patronage than the promotion of science and literature. Knowledge is in every country the surest basis of public happiness, and one in which the measures of government receive their impression so immediately from the sense of community as in ours is proportionably essential. George Washington. How to ruffle a scientist's feathers. When speaking about science to scientists, there is one thing that can be said that will almost always raise their indignation, and that is that science is inherently political, and that the praxis of science is a political act. Science, they will respond, has nothing to do with politics. But is this true? Let's consider the relationship between knowledge and power. Knowledge and power go hand in hand, said Francis Bacon, so that the way to increase in power is to increase in knowledge. At its core, science is a reliable method for creating knowledge and thus power. Because science pushes the boundaries of knowledge, it pushes us to constantly refine our ethics and morality, and that is always political. But beyond that, science constantly disrupts hierarchical power structures and vested interests in a long drive to give knowledge and thus power to the individual, and that process is also political. The politics of science is nothing new. Galileo, for example, committed a political act in 1610 when he simply wrote about his observations through a telescope. Jupiter had moons and Venus had phases, he wrote, which proves that Copernicus had been right in 1543. Earth revolves around the sun, not the other way around, as contemporary opinion and the Roman Catholic Church held. These were simple observations, therefore anyone who wanted to look through Galileo's telescope to see. But the simple statement of an observable fact is a political act that either supports or challenges the current power structure. Every time a scientist makes a factual assertion, Earth goes around the sun, there is such a thing as evolution, humans are causing climate change, it either supports or challenges somebody's vested interests. Consider Galileo's 1633 indictment by the Roman Catholic Church, which was at the time the seat of world political power. 1. The proposition that the sun is the center of the world and immovable from its place is absurd, philosophically false, and formally heretical because it is expressly contrary to Holy Scriptures. 2. The proposition that the earth is not the center of the world, nor immovable, but that it moves and also with a diurnal action is also absurd, philosophically false, and theologically considered at least erroneous in faith. Therefore, invoking the most holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ and of his most glorious Mother Mary, we pronounce this our final sentence. We pronounce, judge, and declare that you, the said Galileo, have rendered yourself vehemently suspected by this holy office of heresy, that is, of having believed and held the doctrine, which is false and contrary to the holy and divine Scriptures, that the sun is the center of the world, and that it does not move from east to west, and that the earth does move, and is not the center of the world. Also, that an opinion can be held and supported as probable after it has been declared and finally decreed contrary to the Holy Scripture. Why did the Church go to such absurd lengths to deal with Galileo? For the same reasons we fight political battles over issues like climate change today. Because facts and observations are inherently powerful, and that power means they are political. Failing to acknowledge this leaves both science and America vulnerable to attack by anti-science thinking that has come to dominate American politics and much of its news media coverage and educational curricula in the early 21st century. Thinking that has steered American politics off course and away from the vision held by the country's founders. Wishing to sidestep the painful moral and ethical parsing that their discoveries sometimes compel, many scientists today see their role to be the creation of knowledge, and believe they should leave the moral, ethical, and political implications for others to sort out. But the praxis of science itself cannot possibly be apolitical, because it takes nothing on faith. The very essence of the scientific process is to question long-held assumptions about the nature of the universe, to dream up experiments that test those questions, and based on those observations, to incrementally build knowledge that is independent of our beliefs and assumptions. A scientifically testable claim is utterly transparent and can be shown to be either most probably true or false, whether the claim is made by a king or a president, a pope, a congressperson, or a common citizen. Because of this, science is inherently anti-authoritarian and a great equalizer of political power. Who defines your reality? The scientific revolution has proven to be more beneficial to humanity than anything previously developed. By building knowledge, we have been able to double our lifespans and boost the productivity of our farms by 35 times. With careful observation and recording, we have been able to give children to those who were barren and the fertile the freedom to decide when and whether to reproduce. Our science now influences every aspect of life, and it has freed us from a life that was, according to Thomas Hobbes, a war of every man against every man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In such remnants of thinking from the Middle Ages, economics was a zero-sum game. Without common power to keep them all in awe, men in Hobbes' time fell into war. There was finite wealth and opportunity, and to get ahead one had to take some away from another. In its capacity to create knowledge, science had the tools to break that zero-sum economic model and generate wealth, health, freedom, nobility, and power beyond Hobbes' wildest dreams. It has given us tremendous insights into our place in the cosmos, into the inner workings of our own bodies, and into our capacity as human beings to exercise our highest aspirations of love, hope, creativity, discovery, compassion, courage, wonder, and charity. Each step forward has come at the price of a political battle. As we continue to refine our knowledge of the way nature really is, independent of our beliefs, perceptions, and wishes for it, we must also refine our ethics and morality and assume more responsibility as humans. Inevitably, this is uncomfortable because the process compels us to give up, alter, or somehow intellectually sequester many comforting notions. Notions that are often profoundly powerful because they are our most deeply rooted and awestruck explanations about the wonders of creation, the specialness of our identities, our history, and the possibility that our spirits may somehow live on after death. The scientific method. How do we create knowledge? There is no one scientific method. Rather, there is a collection of strategies that have proven effective in answering our questions about how things in nature really work. How do plants grow? What is stuff made of? How do viruses work? Why are montane voles promiscuous while prairie voles are loyal lifelong mates? The process usually begins with a question about something, and that suggests a strategy for making and recording observations and measurements. If we want to learn how plants grow, for example, we begin by looking at plants, not rocks. These initial recorded observations suggest a hypothesis, a possible explanation for the observations that partially or fully answers the initial question. The hypothesis must make a risky prediction, one that, if true, will confirm our conclusion, or if false, will destroy it. If there's no possible way to prove the hypothesis is false, then we aren't really doing science. Saying plants grow because God wills it is a statement of faith rather than a statement of science, because A, it's not limited to the natural world, and B, it cannot be disproved. After we set out our hypothesis, we design and conduct experiments that test the hypothesis and try to disprove it. If we can't disprove it, we conclude that it seems to be true and write a paper detailing what we did and concluded. We send it to a professional journal, which sends it to others with knowledge of the field, peer reviewers, to see if they can tear any holes in it. Was our method sound? Did we make any mistakes? Did we control all the possible influences on the outcome? Are there other explanations we didn't think of? Was our math right? If these critical reviewers feel our work is sound enough to stake their reputations on, they recommend our paper for publication. Others who read it may then set out to disprove it. If they can, their stars rise and ours falls a bit. But if they confirm what we found, the conclusion becomes a little more reliable. There are lots of entry points into this process and other strategies besides these, but the main goal is to describe something in the real world that we did not understand before in such a way that it is possible to disprove it, but even so, nobody has yet been able to. In this way, we achieve a high degree of reliability that is a true statement about reality. In other words, that is knowledge. The method is valuable since our senses and our logical processes are easily influenced by our assumptions and wishes, so they often mislead us, but over time the method tends to catch those errors and corrects them. Thus, bit by careful, painstaking bit, we build upon what we know, as distinct from our beliefs and our opinions. How old is Earth? One example of knowledge, as opposed to belief or opinion, is the age of Earth itself. Geological measurements show, over and over, no matter who does the measuring, that Earth is about 4.54 billion years old. This is something you can learn to measure for yourself. It's called radiometric dating. Radioactive uranium isotopes decay at known rates into stable, not radioactive, lead isotopes, and radioactive potassium isotopes decay at known rates into stable argon isotopes. By using a mass spectrometer you can buy on eBay for about $1,000, you can count how many atoms of a particular uranium isotope are left in a rock, and how many atoms of its daughter isotope of lead there are, or how many atoms of potassium are left and how many have decayed into argon. Doing some junior high school math lets you then figure out how old that rock is. Because our whole solar system is thought to have formed at the same time, we can also look at the ages of meteorites and of rocks astronauts brought back from the moon to get a pretty complete picture of Earth's history, and its age consistently comes up to be about 4.54 billion years old. This isn't something we believe, it's something we measure, like the distance between Minneapolis and Dallas. But these measurements conflict with the translations of ancient statements in the Bible that, if taken literally, date Earth at between 6,000 and 7,000 years old. These statements were made before we knew how to measure such things. Who made these statements? Fallible man or all-knowing God? How do we account for that conflict? If we chose the careful, repeatable science of observation and measurements over the emotional comfort and reassurance of the creation stories of old, must we reject the rest of religion, or does it still have value to guide and comfort a moral life? When does life really begin? Careful and reproducible observations and measurements in the biosciences have similarly forced us to repeatedly redefine our traditional ideas about what life itself is and when it begins. Is it a human being first a life when it emerges from the birth canal? Does it have any legal rights as a person before then? Or is it a life at the stage of development where it is able to survive independently outside the womb, even if it is removed from there early, as can happen naturally with premature birth or with a cesarean section? But wait! Perhaps it is really a life when a fertilized egg first implants into the uterine lining, which, based on careful observations, is the medical definition of when a pregnancy begins. A woman cannot be said to be medically pregnant until her body becomes the chemical and biological changes that accompany a symbiotic hosting of the embryo, can she? If it does not, the egg, even if fertilized, is simply flushed. Now, here we are getting into a tricky area because many religious conservatives say, no, it is a life when egg and sperm meet, whether or not the fertilized egg ever implants. But then a scientist would ask, is it still a life at that moment, even if you know from careful observation that 1/3 to 1/2 of all fertilized eggs never implants? And of course that brings up a secondary point. What are fertilized eggs that never implant? How do we define them? As miscarriages, abortions, non-pregnancies, something else? What implications might that definition have for the use of birth control pills that inhibit implantation? Is that abortion, murder, or pregnancy prevention? As our careful observations of life continue, so does our power both to assist and prevent pregnancy. But as our skills improve, new, more troubling questions form. How about if we remove the uterus from the process entirely? Is it life when sperm and egg are joined in a test tube at a fertility clinic and allowed to divide into a group of, say, 16 cells that are then frozen for future implantation in a woman desperate to have children? Can the woman be said to be pregnant as long as this microscopic clump of frozen cells exists? What, if any, right should these frozen cells possess? And is a child conceived in this way a test tube baby, as we once called them, without a soul, as was suggested by some religious conservatives in the 1970s? Once born, are the joy they bring and the contributions they make less valuable? If we make special exception for them by agreeing that in vitro fertilization is not interfering with God's plan, or by acknowledging that they do appear to have souls, why? While we're pondering these quandaries, our observations lead us to yet another new understanding. We don't need sperm to fertilize an egg. We can do it with the nucleus of another cell from the same being. We try this, and sure enough, we can create many identical genetic copies of a sheep or mouse. We call them clones. But then we have to ask, is it a life, or is it just an ovum that has had its nucleus removed and replaced by the nucleus of another cell, and then been chemically or electrically shocked to induce the natural process of cell division without fertilization by sperm? If egg and sperm have never met, is it a life? Or is that creature possibly one day a human damned or soulless like test tube babies were once said to be? Observations tell us that these beings produced in non-traditional ways seem to be the same as any other creatures. We have to ask then, is everyone that remains of the roughly 1.5 million eggs a woman has in her ovaries at birth a life with rights? When does life begin? Is it true, as the comedy troupe Monty Python sang in The Meaning of Life, that every sperm is sacred? Is it a life if we transform adult skin cells into stem cells and those into sperm and egg and then fertilize one with the other? And is that a clone or something else? Is it a life if we design its genome on a computer, as scientists of the J. Craig Venter Institute have done, buy a DNA synthesizer on eBay for $8,000 or so, use it to make fragments of the genome we designed, chemically stitch them together, inject the complete genome into a cell with an empty nucleus, and chocolate into replicating? Here we have made a living reproducing things starting with a computer design and a few common chemicals. What does that mean for our ideas about life? Is it wrong to be doing this, to be asking these questions, applying these observations, gaining these powers? What is life? Is life an unbroken chain of genetic code running down through the generations, endlessly recombining in new forms? Is it software? When does it become an individual with rights? Where do we draw the legal line, the moral line? Can we draw a line at all? Is that the right way to be thinking about it? In each of the above cases, new knowledge was gained by applying the scientific method of making careful observations and recording the data, then testing and drawing conclusions based on the results instead of on assumptions and beliefs, and then publishing those for others to review and attempt to disprove if they can. The knowledge gained through this incredible process gives us new power over the physical world, the power to assist or prevent pregnancy, but it also forces us to reevaluate intuitive assumptions and to refine and, in some cases, redefine the meanings of words and values we thought we understood. This power and these new definitions have moral, ethical, and legal implications for how we conduct our lives. As our knowledge becomes more refined and precise, so too must our social contracts, and this process is inherently and continuously disruptive to moral, ethical, financial, and political authority. Science itself is inherently political and inherently anti-authoritarian. Authoritarian politics. Because this is the case, it's reasonable to ask how science fits into political thought. Science writer Timothy Ferriss reminds us that in politics there are not just two forces, the progressive left encouraging change and the conservative right seeking constancy. In fact, there are four. Imagined on a vertical axis, there are also the authoritarian, totalitarian, closed, and controlling at the bottom of the axis, and the anti-authoritarian, liberal, open, and freedom-loving at the top, which one can argue have actually played more fundamental roles in history. Politics, then, can be more accurately thought of as a box with four quadrants, rather than as a linear continuum from left to right. Now, I don't know if you can see, but he has put in the four quadrants and shown the different political spectrums in that way. Any one of the infinite gradations of political thought can be placed on the plane around these axes. When looked at in historical perspective, it's clear that while science and republican democracy are anti-authoritarian systems of knowledge and of governance, respectively, they are neither progressive nor conservative. Both communism on the left and fascism on the right are authoritarian and opposed to the freedom of inquiry and expression that characterize science and democracy, just as fundamentalist and authoritarian religions do. Alternatively, left-leaning progressives and right-leaning conservatives in America can find common cause in the anti-authoritarian principles of freedom of inquiry and expression, universal education, and individual human rights that go hand in hand with the liberal, meaning free thinking that informs science and democracy. The life of conservative writer David Horowitz, who was part of the radical New Left movement in the late 1960s, but is now on the radical right, provides an example of how one can move 180 degrees ideologically from left to right, but still maintain the general level of liberal anti-authoritarianism vertically. Top-wing politics. The present-day Republican Party provides an example of how politics actually breaks down into these four quadrants rather than in a simple left-right continuum. Its constituents range from anti-government anarchists on the top to totalitarian fundamentalists on the bottom, but both groups are right-wing. There is currently a power struggle going on between the anti-authoritarian Tea Party top wing and the authoritarian big government family values bottom wing. The George W. Bush administration did a masterful job of uniting these disparate ends of the vertical spectrum by first rebranding progressives as liberals, thus silencing liberal conservatives, and then by using pro-freedom, anti-totalitarian small government rhetoric on one hand and anti-science, pro-fundamentalist rhetoric on the other, directing half of the argument at each wing. In actuality, Bush became the opposite of liberal. He increased government spending, limited individual freedoms, asserted totalitarian authority by suspending habeas corpus and detaining American citizens indefinitely, and eroded the barriers that keep state and religion safe from one another. He moved from a full right conservative position to a full authoritarian bottom wings position, becoming an authoritarian who grew the size and control of governments. This move was made possible by the reaction to 9/11, which drove the country toward fascism, a lower right position. Bush was a very effective leader in that he moved a large portion of the public to follow his direction, but his presidency became the most illiberal and anti-democratic in American history, as well as, not surprisingly, the most anti-science. This was aided by 2 generations of scientists having gone silent in the national dialogue, and the voices of authoritarians like conservative talk show host Rush Limbaugh and his self-described ditto heads holding sway. This left a void in the top right quadrants for the Tea Party to fill. The Tea Party is not as concerned with the epithet liberal because it is in some ways a liberal movement in that it purports to place a high value on freedom. But the Tea Party risks being co-opted by bottom-wing authoritarians unless it extends its top-wing embrace of freedom to include science, diversity, religion, and tolerance, all of which it currently seems antagonistic to in varying degrees. In the wake of the Bush presidency, the already clear rift between the 2 dominant perspectives on the right, the small government libertarians/anarchists and the theocratic fundamentalists, began to grow even wider. Far more than the conservative or liberal philosophy, it is who wins the argument between authoritarians who value top-down control and conformity and anti-authoritarians who value bottom-up freedom and tolerance that will drive the success or failure of the United States on the major issues of the 21st century. This argument has little to do with current party politics and everything to do with science. Like it or not, the world is now fully dependent on science. Without it, we could not sustain our population or our environment. Science is driving the entire conversation, and the country needs a political framework that will allow it to adapt to these changes successfully. This requires making some adjustments in our understanding of the role and purpose of nations and legal and regulatory systems. Thus, the independent lover of science in the future will tend to be fiscally conservative and socially liberal, seeking a live and let live ethos in the name of freedom and natural law, using government regulation to optimize freedom and level playing fields. The neoconservative fundamentalists will tend to be fiscally liberal and socially conservative, seeking big government control of personal behavior in the name of morality and security while opposing regulation that increases freedom or levels playing fields. Democracy, an endangered species? The challenge to authority that science presents is one of many reasons why it has flourished in free democratic societies. It is not a coincidence that the ongoing scientific revolution has been led in significant part by the United States and other free democratic societies. But it is also partly why, since the late 20th century, the political climate has increasingly hampered U.S. policymakers in dealing with so many critical science policy issues, and why the United States may soon cede both its leadership in scientific research and development and the economic and social benefits that leadership provides. Thomas Jefferson's fundamental notion that when well-informed, people can be trusted with their own government lies at the center of democracy. Without a well-informed voter, the very exercise of democracy becomes removed from the problems it is charged with solving. The more complex the world becomes, the more challenging it is for democracy to function, because it places an increased burden of education and information upon the people, and in the 21st century that includes science education and science reporting. Without the mooring provided by the well-informed opinion of the people, governments may become paralyzed, or worse, corrupted by powerful interests seeking to oppress and enslave. For this reason and others, Jefferson was a staunch advocate of free public education and freedom of the press, the primary purposes of which were to ensure an educated and well-informed people. In 1787, he wrote to James Madison, "And say, finally, whether peace is best preserved by giving energy to the government or information to the people. This last is the most certain and the most legitimate engine of government. Educate and inform the whole mass of the people. Enable them to see that it is their interest to preserve peace and order, and they will preserve them. And it requires no very high degree of education to convince them of this. They are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty." But what do we do when the level of complexity actually does require a very high degree of education? Can democracy still function effectively? Will American-style democracy run by the people be able to compete in the complex science-driven global economy with nations like China, which is run by highly educated engineers and scientists who have moved into government leadership roles? It's a critically important question, both for America and for our ideas about liberty. That brings us to the end of Chapter 2. It also brings us to the end of Part 1, America's Science Problem. Next week, we will start Part 2, Yesterday's Science Politics, and cover Chapter 3, Religion Meets Science. Thanks for watching.